Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and we are so grateful that you could join us. Let me just give you kind of an overview of the next couple of hours. We're going to focus some time and attention on, first of all, a couple of key pieces of legislation in front of the Texas legislature you might like to know about. Then one of the articles, the party of groupthink. We sort of alluded to that the other day, in which you have had just a remarkable number in both the House and the Senate, who are Democrats who vote in lockstep. And that has certainly never been the case with Republicans, much less even with Democrats maybe a few decades ago. But if there's one thing you can assume now, is that no matter how liberal or left-wing a piece of legislation might be, you can always pretty much guarantee enough of those Democratic votes. And that's certainly the case in the House of Representatives, and usually has been the case even in the United States Senate. So we'll talk about that. Also, I thought I would revisit this question that we talked about on Friday about how the military has been coming down on Tucker Carlson, of all people, but also anybody else that would want to suggest that the goal of the military is anything other than inclusion, which is kind of intriguing. Some gun control legislation. And before we're done, if we have some time, wanted to talk about Robert Knight's piece today, The War on Normal. I don't know if you've seen this, but Unilever, which is, of course, the major multinational corporation that produces all sorts of different products that you probably use, have decided that they just can't use the word normal anymore, because that would offend somebody or that would exclude something. You know, when I buy shampoo and I see you got shampoo for dry hair, normal hair, and oily hair, you know, if I had oily hair, I wouldn't feel excluded. I'd just say, I'm glad they recognize that my hair isn't, quote, normal. But, of course, apparently that's hurting people's feelings. And so we want to now not have anything for normal skin care, normal hair care. I mean, it just illustrates, again, some of the craziness that has taken hold of our society. And I had not picked up on that one till I read Robert Knight's piece. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But let's see if we can, since so many of you are listening in the state of Texas and probably are pro-life, and even if you're not in the state of Texas, probably like to know about this. We have a couple of very significant pro-life bills in the legislature, and I thought you might want to know about those because they fit into the broader issue of what is happening in various state legislatures around the country. One of those is a Human Life Protection Act, which was introduced in the House by Giovanni Caprileone, excuse me, always have trouble with that name, and Angela Paxton has been on the program with us. And the goal of this is to actually establish that if indeed, for example, Roe versus Wade is overturned, that the state of Texas would be a pro-life state. And you have about 10 states that have already passed similar legislation, and this would reaffirm the legislature's intent to end abortion. And, of course, if you might think about it, that was the original law in the state of Texas, and in particular in Dallas, that led to Roe versus Wade. So that's a piece of legislation. It may be tough sledding in this legislative session, but if indeed it passes, Then Texas will join 10 other states that have already passed similar kinds of legislation. The second one is one that has been introduced as well, both in the House and the Senate. Representative Stephanie Klick and Eddie Lucio have introduced one called the Chemical Abortion Safety Protocols. And this is one that actually puts into the Texas statute all the various FDA requirements and rules for a chemical abortion. And so it provides various safeguards. And frankly, even if you're not pro-life, you would say, yes, we would want to do this because those are very important safeguards for a woman's health. But you know how this will surface. It will always be portrayed as only an attempt to limit a woman's access to abortion. In this case, we're talking about chemical abortions, but nevertheless, that is a piece of legislation there as well. And then finally, we have one that's called the Conscience Protection Bill, and that one actually has been introduced in the House by Keith Bell, and also in the Senate by Drew Springer. By the way, just one election there as well. This would require a hospital healthcare facility to provide written notice of an individual's legal right to refuse to perform an abortion. The bottom line is we have federal statutes and state statutes that prohibit healthcare workers from being compelled to participate in abortions, but this would be actually another step to even make that more obvious and to even have those posted. So those are a couple of the pro-life bills in front of the legislature, and of course we will perhaps have a chance to talk about that with some of those sponsors, but I just wanted you to know that that is taking place. At the same time, as we move away from the state of Texas, I might just mention that now many of those bills will get a hearing. Many of those bills will have a chance to be voted on, and we'll kind of keep track of what will happen at the end of the legislative session as to the status of some of those bills related to everything from religious liberty, gun control, limiting the authority of the governor during emergencies like we had last year, and some of these pro-life issues as well. Let's, if we can, though, talk about one of the articles I've posted here today. It comes from the Washington Examiner, and it actually is entitled The Party of Groupthink, because they start out in this particular piece by James Antle by saying that you really have a remarkable agreement between Joe Biden and his press secretary, as well, Joan Psaki, and even people like Bernie Sanders. And so, if nothing else, this, I think, really comes back to one of the things that Joe Biden said during his campaign, because he pledged to fulfill Bernie Sanders' wishes of being the most progressive president since FDR, and at the same time, of course, made the argument that he was a bipartisan deal maker. Well, we can see that the deal-making hasn't gone anywhere, and we sort of knew that. But nevertheless, here is something that was very intriguing because, again, the author reminds us that left-wing Democrats turned out for Joe Biden in a way they did not turn out for Hillary Clinton 4 years ago, in part because they were so upset about how, I think, Bernie Sanders was treated. And so, as a result, this may well be offset by the conservative Hispanic and black voters that actually ended up in the Republican column as well. But this shift, if nothing else, has been so significant that it has allowed for the opportunity now to not even necessarily have to court some of the so-called moderate Democrats, the so-called blue dog Democrats, because many of them simply lost in either the midterm elections in 2018 or else were actually losing in the 2020 election, where Republicans took over many of those districts, many of which were suburban districts. And so as a result, though requires even less courting of some of those individuals. And now we have perhaps the most polarized Congress of our least recent memory. And when we come back from the break, I want to talk about what that means in terms of other legislation that might likely make its way through both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. But let's take a break, and it's the first article we've posted here today on Groupthink. We'll get back into a couple of other key issues that we have on the table, but we need to take a break, and we'll be back right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Do we have a crisis at the border? Earlier this month, the Biden administration acknowledged that it was a challenge, but downplayed that it was a crisis. The statement shows how politicians change the rules and criteria in order to fit their narrative. Alejandro Mayorkas serves as the Secretary of Homeland Security in the Biden administration. She rejected reporter questions about the crisis on the border by merely saying it was a challenge. But it was the same woman who a few years ago, as Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, who along with Vice President Joe Biden referred to the border crisis when there were 1,000 attempted crossings a day. The Border Patrol reported that on one day recently there were 6,000 border crossings in one day. When the Obama administration was in office 7 years ago, 1,000 border crossings in a day was a crisis. Today, in the Biden administration, 6,000 border crossings in a day isn't a crisis. Someone who believes it is a crisis is Democratic member of Congress Henry Cuellar. He finally decided to send pictures of a border facility crowded with men, women, and children to the Houston Chronicle. As a Democrat, he says he supports the Biden administration, but felt he needed to do more and encouraged the administration to listen to people at the border. He is frustrated that the administration is listening to the immigration activists and advocates and needs to listen to the border communities. If we're to address the festering problem of immigration and border security, we must start by telling the truth. Denying a crisis when one exists is not a good first step. I applaud Representative Cuellar for calling attention to an issue ignored by this administration and often ignored by the media. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention as a program note that at the top of the hour, we're going to have Joe Rosenberg with us, and so we're going to be spending some time talking with him about his new book, which is entitled The Beirut Protocol, and of course talk about what's going on in Israel and a number of other things. At the 2 o'clock hour, Greg Koukl will be with us. We'll be talking about his piece, When Spiritual Heroes Fall. Obviously, the reason for that has to do with Ravi Zacharias and his ministry and even some of the legal challenges coming right now. But the broader principle is, what do we do when we see whatever it might be? It could be your pastor. It could be somebody that's in ministry fall. How do we react to some of that? And I think it'll be a good piece for us to have as a conversation. And, of course, maybe some of you want to weigh in with your comments as well about whether it's Ravi Zacharias or other issues that have been of concern to you in the past. But let's get back to this first article, The Party of Groupthink. I've talked about the fact that this has been a remarkable alliance, if you will, between those who would be considered left-wing and even socialist, and those who are oftentimes portrayed, at least in the media, as being a little bit more moderate. I don't know that Joe Biden fits into that category, but nevertheless, that was the way he was portrayed during the various campaigns. But if nothing else, there are now a very significant number of issues, not the least of which is after seeing this vote on the $1.9 trillion so-called COVID relief package or stimulus package, where you did not see anyone stray, not even Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who's oftentimes been portrayed as perhaps the most moderate of the Senate Democrats. then this is why you're having more and more people saying that we really should be prepared for something that could be pretty dramatic. In this article, for example, they have a quote from Matt Gaetz. It is the Trojan horse, he says, for socialism. It is everything Democrats have wanted wrapped and branded in coronavirus so that people are scared into voting for it. Marsha Blackburn, who is a senator from Tennessee, argued that 91% of the spending is money for the arts, humanities, transportation, abortion, loan forgiveness for students, loan forgiveness for socially disadvantaged farmers. And again, that number comes from the argument that has been made, and it was made even yesterday in some of the talking head shows, by the House Majority Leader, that only 9% goes directly to COVID. And I, again, would hasten to say the 9% is true when it only goes for COVID. But when you go back and look at the other things that are the result of having the lockdowns, including even the stimulus amounts, you can say that it's more than 9%, but it isn't 100% either. Even the most liberal think tank that I quoted from, I think about a week ago, could best only come up with about 85% of it that could be in even the most significantly distant way connected to COVID-19. You say, well, 85% is not bad. Well, just recognize that 15% of $1.9 trillion is about $300 billion. So again, and that was being the most generous possible, because as Marsha Blackburn points out, a lot of it does go for the arts. It goes for loan forgiveness. It goes for abortion and a variety of other things that have nothing to do with COVID. Anyway, the article goes on to say that this is the way Democrats are legislating now, despite their razor-thin majorities, because they basically have razor-thin majorities in the House and even in the Senate. Remember, it's 50-50, which again just makes you wonder if just one of the Republican candidates in Georgia in the U.S. Senate special election won, David Perdue, for example, this would be even less of an issue than it is right now. But nevertheless, then they talk about now that we have seen the passage of this issue, the COVID $1.9 trillion bill. What about the others? Because they talk about, in this one, the election reform bill, H.R. 1, which we'll talk about in just a minute, the For the People Act, which they say is a collection of liberal policy priorities on that issue, the Equality Act, which is a sweeping reform of how sex is defined under the federal civil rights law, and then an immigration plan, which is another one of these so-called comprehensive immigration plans, yet with fewer concessions to border security and enforcement than even some of the previous proposals that garnered at least some kind of Republican support in the Senate. So again, it's interesting because the Democrats' majority, they point out, are small, but they're more ideologically homogeneous because, after all, many of those centrists, many of those so-called moderate Democrats aren't there anymore. A couple of examples they use is that Dan Lipinski, who was one of the only pro-life members of the House of Representatives in the Democratic Party, fell to a liberal primary challenger, and then others like Representative Colin Peterson in Minnesota were removed by Republicans. And so as a result, what you have right now is a very ideologically pure, if you will, Democratic Party. And the comparison is, think about the fact that when President Bill Clinton was in power, he had to contend with, they say, for example, Senator Sam Nunn, who was a Southern conservative who chaired the Armed Services Committee, and as a result in the Senate balked at the idea of homosexuals in the military. But now you have two Democratic senators from Georgia that are staunch liberals. And then it goes on, even President Barack Obama had to shelve the public option as part of the health care plan in order to appease some of the centrists in his party. And so that was something that even a few years ago was something that the current president had to address. But now you don't have anything of the sort. So what will happen in the future? Well, the issue is simply this. If indeed the Senate keeps the filibuster, and at the moment it looks like that it will, then you have to end up with 60 votes or nothing happens. And you might say, well, yeah, but how did they pass this last bill with just 50 votes because it passed 50 to 49. Well, that's due to what's called budget reconciliation, and it is limited in terms of both subject matter and even the number of times each year it can be used. So having a stimulus passed by party lines was a possible, but it's less likely for some of the other things that we're going to talk about. But of course, all we have to do is see some kind of up or down vote to eliminate the filibuster, and then you wouldn't need 60 votes. You would only need 50, and that could change just about everything. One of the points I thought I'd make real quickly is as we go to the break, we have a take action item where if you have not already sent a note to your 2 United States senators on the HR for the People Act, we have information about that. But Hans von Spakovsky has been on this program with us many times before, was in the Federal Elections Commission, came up with 8 of the worst parts of this legislation. He says, number one, it would eviscerate state voter ID laws that require a voter to authenticate his identity. Number two, it would make absentee ballots even more insecure than they are right now. Number three, it would worsen the problem of inaccurate registration rolls, which are full of people who have died, moved away, or ineligible because they're felons or non-citizens. It would take away your ability to decide whether you want to register to vote. Instead, it requires states to automatically register individuals who interact with state agencies like the DMV. Number five, it would force states to allow online registration, opening up a voter registration system which could be easily hacked and certainly could be used in terms of fraud in many ways. Number six, it would impose onerous new regulatory restrictions on political speech and activity, including online and policy-related speech by candidates, citizens, civic groups, unions, corporations, and nonprofit organizations. Number seven, it would authorize the IRS to investigate and consider the political and policy implications and positions of nonprofit organizations when they apply for tax-exempt status, and we saw that years ago under the Obama administration. And number eight, it would set up a public funding program for candidates running for Congress, essentially forcing taxpayers to subsidize the political campaigns of individuals, even if they might disagree with those individuals. And so those are just 8 of the worst things that he's identified in the For the People Act. And that should be reason enough for you that if you have not contacted your 2 United States senators, go to our website, which is pointofview.net. The middle section there says Take Action. You click on the Take Action button, scroll down there, contact your senators. You can put in your zip code. We give you some suggested talking points, but if you put in your zip code, then if you have already done this before, your address will pop up. If not, you can put your address in there so they can, at the United States Senate, write back to you and respond to you. And we give you a suggested letter that you can edit and then hit the button that says Submit, and it sends it to your 2 United States senators. We've made it about as easy as possible, so visit the website, pointofview.net, and we'll be right back.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. About a half an hour, we're going to be talking with our good friend Joel Rosenberg, and looking forward to that opportunity as we talk about his new book, The Beirut Protocol. We'll also talk about all things Middle East and Israel, and I think you'll enjoy that, and we'll certainly encourage you to give him a phone call if you've got some questions about what's going on. Get an update on how they're doing in terms of vaccinations. As I understand, Israel is doing the best of any country in the world in terms of the percentage of people being vaccinated. Last time we talked with him, he was basically quarantined in his bedroom, so it'll be fun to hear a little bit more about what's going on there, and maybe getting a little bit of a hint as to whether or not the various trips that we have planned to Israel, whether those are going to come off in light of all sorts of obvious questions that we've had over this last year. Let me, if I can, now go to the third article we've posted, and that has to do about the military. It is an article that was written by Matt Walsh, and then I have a follow-up that I did not post, but it has to do with the fact that Ted Cruz, Representative, or I should say Senator Ted Cruz, wants to call in the military and begin to ask some questions. And we did discuss this on Friday, but it's worth revisiting again for a couple of reasons. First of all, let me issue my disclaimer as I always do. We support those of you that do serve in the military or have served in the military, but there have been times when we have said on this program, you have not been well served by those in command over you. And you can't talk about it, so we will. And this whole flap developed a week ago when Tucker Carlson just simply pointed out that in this particular speech given by President Biden, with two women who were going to be command generals behind him, went into this whole long discussion about what we're doing to include more women, and kind of made fun of it a little bit in light of the fact that shouldn't we be more concerned about the fact that we have a real adversary out there known as China that we need to prepare for, and what do maternity flight suits and hairstyles have anything to do with that? Well, that led to an incredible backlash. And again, this is a good example of a fight that I would not have picked. Why would I want to pick a fight with the U.S. military? But once the fight is engaged, I'm not going to back away from it, because the answer that we got back is, well, we're all about diversity and inclusion. And if you can express to me and convince me that diversity and inclusion are making you a much more elite fighting unit, I am all for it, but I think you know where this is leading. So let's go to the piece by Matt Walsh and see what he has to say. He said, while leaders of other countries are focusing on making their militaries into more effective and deadlier fighting machines which thrive at the central task of defeating the enemy, the folks in charge of our military have an entirely different set of priorities. For them, America's greatest adversary isn't China or any other world power, but intolerance. And the best way to defeat intolerance is through the promotion of diversity and inclusion. He goes on to make some other statements, but I'll jump down to help you understand that after Tucker Carlson made his comment about this, then you have this quote from the Military Times. Senior leaders dunk on Tucker Carlson's misogynistic comments about maternity flight suits. An inaccurate headline, to put it mildly, but nevertheless. NBC News, Tucker Carlson slammed by military leaders for mocking pregnant service members. Again, not the case. And Yahoo News, Pentagon takes unprecedented shot at Tucker Carlson for dissing military diversity. And so, again, the whole issue was, of course, as he was hearing the president giving these remarks on International Women's Day and talking about offering maternity flight suits and to update hairstyle requirements, his point was those don't really simply seem to be trying to make the military better at what the military is supposed to do. That's protect the country and ultimately try to defer a war, but then win a war if you have to fight one. And so Matt Walsh points out that these changes are based not on science and data, but on ideology. And he points out that Tucker Carlson's right, and it's likely that the fact that he is right that provoked the military leadership to go to DEFCON 1. And, of course, some of the criticism was, okay, that Tucker Carlson has no military experience, and that the decision to include more pregnant women in the armed forces was made by medical experts. So Matt Walsh, again, in his article says, the problem with this argument is that it's beside the point. The fact that he's never served in the military does not preclude him from making common sense observations about the military. It doesn't preclude you and me, even if you have not served in the military, from also pointing out some particular problems that have surfaced in the military. And also, Matt Walsh goes on to say, and the fact that medical experts said that it's okay to have pregnant women piloting aircraft does not mean that it's better or even good to have more pregnant women piloting aircraft. I hope you understand that as well. And so he goes on to explain in the next section But the problem isn't that the Biden administration wants to include women in the military. They've already been included for decades, obviously. It's that he wants to take more active steps to recruit more and more women and get them more involved in combat at every level. And again, Matt Walsh says we need to ask this question once again. Will this make the military better at killing the bad guys? And then he quotes from a study done by NPR, National Public Radio, put this one out. And there are many others, but I'll just use his quote here, in which a year-long Marine Corps study trying to understand how gender integration would affect combat readiness has found that all male units were faster, more lethal, and able to evacuate casualties in less time. Overall, according to a summary of the study, all male squads perform better than mixed groups in 69% of the tasks evaluated. And so he comes back and said, okay, all male unit, what's that best known for? Faster and more lethal. So I think faster and more lethal is better. Slower and less lethal is not so good. That's common sense, I think. Right? I mean, are we missing something here? Now, I did share the other day that Penna Dexter has talked with Elaine Donnelly, and I remember this from years ago when Elaine Donnelly was on, and she was pointing out that when the Marines Corps was actually evaluating this, they had one number that I thought was really striking, and that is when they evaluated the women and their ability to throw a hand grenade more than 15 meters. Why would you want to throw it 15 meters? Because when the hand grenade goes off, you get a blast zone that's about 15 meters all the way around in radius, or 30 meters in diameter. And if you can't throw that more than about 5 meters, do you see what the problem is? Yes, and almost half of the women in the Marine Corps. Now, these are women that self-selected. After all, it's an all-volunteer army. They wanted to go into the Marine Corps. They probably were more likely to be physically fit than the average woman, maybe even more aggressive. Maybe their parents had been in the Marine Corps. Maybe their brothers had been in the Marine Corps. So they wanted to go in there, and yet they found that almost half of them could not throw a hand grenade 15 meters. And this is where you get into the task of, would this not only make you less lethal, but make you dangerous? And, of course, then the ability to evacuate these casualties is, of course, one other issue that came out of that study that was reported by NPR. Now, he says on the other side of this argument has evidence that, in fact, women make, if you do have the idea that women make the military more lethal, then why don't you present it? Makes sense. But this argument that inclusion is our strength, Matt Walsh says, this, of course, is madness. If inclusion is our strength, then why have boot camp at all? Why have any physical or performance standards, which, by the way, sometimes have been lowered? Why have elite units like the SEALs and Rangers, if indeed the goal is simply to have inclusion? But, of course, those are to weed out the weakest. Matt Walsh doesn't say it in this article, but I saw in one of his videos that, and I'd forgotten this, that the SEALs do allow women to try to compete and to actually become part of a SEAL team. And the fact that a woman has ever qualified yet, probably tells you something. Now, is there a possibility someday there will be a woman? I've met some women that are bigger than I am, stronger than I am. I even went to high school with some of these Olympic swimmers, and I used to jokingly say, I don't even want to arm wrestle them because they're so much stronger. So is it possible someday that a woman might get her way and get on a SEAL team? Possibly. But let's again use common sense. The exception does not prove the rule. And so, again, one of the reasons why now we see that Ted Cruz wants to actually call a conference and to bring some people from the military together is to explain some of this. So after the break, we'll talk about his comment real briefly and get in just a couple of other issues in the news because there are so many things happening. We will run out of topics before we run out of time. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then, of course, at the top of the hour, as we've been talking about, Joel Rosenberg will be with us, and looking forward to that interview. Before I get into the next article about how many people have died from taking the vaccine, that's a big issue. We'll get into that in just a minute. I did want to point out that Texas Senator Ted Cruz actually has been very concerned about some of the things that have happened, and he said under President Biden, the military is launching political attacks to intimidate Tucker Carlson and other civilians who criticize their policy decisions. Officials in uniform are being used for the campaign. I'm demanding a meeting with the commandant of the USMC to put a stop to this, because some of those came, of course, those in the Marine Corps. And if nothing else, it has to do with the fact that theoretically, under the defense of the Directive 1344, military are not permitted to engage in partisan politics. Now, they may just say, we're just defending that, but okay, let's have a hearing about that. And, of course, the point Ted Cruz has pointed out is when Tucker Carlson compared the Chinese government, which is building a massive naval operation and now has the largest navy in the world, sleep well, America, to the fact that the priority seems to be with some people in the Defense Department to changing regulations for women's hairstyles, issuing maternity flight suits, that maybe some of the priorities are being missed. So we'll see what happens. And Ted Cruz is well aware of the fact that some of these changes are being made and probably aren't necessarily in the best interest necessarily of combat readiness, but more importantly, what in the world, because there's a whole series of tweets and posts and comments and interviews all coming after Tucker Carlson. If nothing else, if he wanted to be the center of attention, he certainly is right at the moment. Which brings me to my fourth article, which I have waited till now to say, because I was looking for a news peg to hang on this. I've been doing the research over the last couple of weeks. How many people have died after taking the COVID vaccine? We'll get to that in just a minute, but the article I've posted is about the fact that a boxing legend, some of us might remember, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, got the vaccine and then died. And there have been all sorts of people since then that have now posted certain things. For example, one social media post said, "I'm proper gutted. The great Marvin Hagler dies after taking the vaccine. Please do not do your own research before making a decision on putting something in your body that has not been tested properly, and we're being used as guinea pigs and not told the truth about the vaccine." Of course, you've always had some of the reaction from the so-called anti-vaxxers, but it has been kind of interesting to look at some of the numbers that I've been collecting lately on the number of individuals, not just as we pointed out before, who are African American that won't take the vaccine. The highest percentage are Asian Americans, lowest percentage African Americans will take the vaccine. There was a piece by our friend David French pointing out that a lot of evangelical Christians won't take the vaccine. But the one that I found most intriguing the other day is the very high percentage of frontline workers that won't take the vaccine in various places. And so we'll get into that in just a minute. But once you've had Marvelous Marvin Hagler, who dies after taking the vaccine, or this one, which is also getting a lot of press, this 39-year-old Utah woman, no underlying health conditions, died 4 days after receiving her second dose of the Moderna vaccine. There have been all sorts of people starting to say, well, how many people actually have died from the vaccine? Would that happen? Yes. I mean, we started with this assumption a long time ago. I've told the story before of one of my childhood friends who they gave him penicillin and died from penicillin. We began to recognize that even, various things that can save your life you can get just a terrible reaction to. I think now they probably would have been saving his life, but that's the case. So I've been looking at these numbers, and these numbers can be found, interesting enough, give credit where credit is due, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, have what's called a VAERS system. VAERS stands for Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. Now, you've had some individuals who have taken every one of those numbers and said, well, that every person reported on the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System who died, they all died because of the vaccine. That's not logical. But how many are there? And the reason that this is now raised a little higher issue is Newsweek, again, let's give them credit, took on this fact check because they pointed out that there was a news outlet that reported back earlier this month, so the number's higher now, that 966 people have died having taken the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. Now, if you go back and look at the original report, it shows that 472 died after receiving the Moderna vaccine, 489 died after receiving the Pfizer vaccine, and then another 5 died after receiving a jab from an unknown manufacturer. So that was in the records, okay? So that's what we know. So that's the claim. What are the facts? Well, there's an obvious first statement. That is, 966 people did die after they had the vaccine, but that doesn't necessarily mean what? That the vaccine was the cause. And so over time, I've been watching where in many cases, the CDC has gone back to check those out. Now, the first study I saw happened in very early January, where you already had 35 people die after getting the vaccine. And they were able to eliminate, at that time, 16 people that had what are called comorbidities and things of that nature, that there could have been some other things. If I give you the vaccine, 2 days later you have a heart attack. Did the vaccine cause the heart attack? And, of course, it's the same question we've had about the way they report COVID deaths. You know, did you die from COVID-19 or did you die with COVID-19? And we've reported, matter of fact, I think we still have it posted here. Yeah, is the COVID death count inflated? Because we have some people that died in a motorcycle crash and then they were listed as a COVID-19 death. And we know that's not the case. Well, the same kind of thing needs to happen here in terms of logic. So how did Newsweek rate that particular statistic? Mostly true, which I got to give them credit for. The database is dense with data, they say, and the other system that I won't get into because it's kind of in the weeds here gives slightly different statistics. But certainly it is true that after these people receive the vaccine, you have 966, and that was earlier this month. The number's probably pretty close to 1,000 now if it's not. But they also then go on to say it's false to say that the COVID vaccines caused all 966 deaths because the VERS database is not designed to give that information. So anyway, I just thought that I would wait until you had someone of note, and some of you that are boxing fans will remember Marvin Hagler. Some of the others are going to say, I've never heard of him in my life, but the fact is you have a boxing legend who did die shortly thereafter receiving a vaccine, and there are at least some people out there that are absolutely convinced that the vaccine was a contributor, and it is probably, again, something that we've talked about before and something that we shouldn't necessarily ignore. But you know that there'll be a lot of people trying to disclaim all of that because they want as many people to be vaccinated as possible. But I just want to tell you the truth that if you look at the VERS system at that time, earlier this month, when that number was showing up in various tweets and other places that 966 people died after receiving the vaccine, the number is true. The cause is not necessarily as easy to determine. And so that's what we know, and we'll certainly report more when we find it out. Let's take a break, though. Joe Rosenberg will be with us, and we'll talk with him right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to talk with our good friend Joe Rosenberg, New York Times best-selling author of 16 novels, 5 nonfiction books, nearly 5 million copies in print, individual who now lives in Israel, and we'll be talking about his new book, The Beirut Protocol. Last time we talked about the Kremlin conspiracy, in the past the Persian Gamble, and many others. This is going to be a great opportunity, certainly, to update our story about Marcus Riker, but most importantly, find out what's happening in Israel, what's happening to Joel Rosenberg. So, Joel, as always, it is a delight to have you on the program.
Well, it's a delight to be with you. Shalom from Jerusalem, Kerby.
Well, we have to ask how you're doing. I think the last time we talked to you, you were actually in quarantine in your bedroom. And so obviously so many things have changed in your life and in Israel. We've been hearing that Israel's probably done better in vaccinating its citizens than any other country. But give us a kind of an update on what's going on.
Happy to, Kerby. Yes, I think a year ago we were talking. I had just launched the book tour, or was trying to, for the Jerusalem Assassin, and that tour essentially got scuttled because of COVID, and Israel urged all of its citizens to return back to Israel as fast as possible because the borders might close. And that is, in fact, what happened. We've gone through a whole series of ups and downs here in Israel. My family, thank God, has been very healthy and safe, and we haven't gotten the disease. But more than 6,000 Israelis have died this past year from COVID. Now, by American standards, that seems so small. But 6,000 deaths here in Israel is more Israelis dead in 1 year than all of the wars and terrorist attacks that we've faced in the past 25 years. So that puts into perspective, when you're talking about a small country of about 9.5 million people, 6,000 deaths is a huge number. But the good news, and the government it's handled it well at sometimes, not well at others, but the good news is, at the moment, yes, we have about 80+% of all of our eligible citizens who want to get the vaccine have received it, and that's pretty amazing. 80+%. If you add into that, then people who already have had the disease and recovered, and then children for whom the vaccine is not yet, ready, or they're not sure if it's ready. That's closing in on having everybody in good shape. So it's not a mandate that you have to get it here, but it's been encouraged, and my family, we're all vaccinated, and yet the airport is still closed for most outbound traffic.
Right.
Israelis are being allowed to come back in because 7 days from today we have yet another election. I'm sure we'll get to that at some point in the program. But
that was one of my next questions. Yes.
Yeah, we don't have absentee ballots unless you're a diplomat. So Israelis are pouring back into the country to vote, and so Israel, of course, has opened up the airport for that. But yeah, it's been very challenging, and the economy has been shot. Tourism is effectively dead. It's been a very, very painful year.
Yes. Well, let me ask about that. I do want to get to the 4 elections in 2 years, but for just a minute, a number of our listeners say, hey, we'd like to go to Israel. Of course, we have planned a trip to Israel and another one to Greece and some of that in the future. We recognize that in the near term, it's not going to happen, but any thoughts about that? Because tourism is such a very significant part of the Israeli economy, and that has certainly been devastating, hasn't it?
It has been devastating, and it's a great question, Kerby. We, as you know, launched a new website, news and analysis site called All Israel News last September. You can find it at allisrael.com, and we have a sister site, All Arab News. We are tracking that story, and because people are very curious. So at the moment, the airport is only open for Israelis returning and for people with very special circumstances. We have Arab diplomats coming in because of the Abraham Accords. We have a judo team coming in from the Gulf, and so things like that. But mostly, no tourists are allowed at all. So, but based on the reporting that we've been doing for All Israel News, our sense is that the country will start to open up just for more regular air traffic, probably in the summer. I wouldn't really suspect that you'd see tour groups until the fall, but I would not rule out the possibility of people, if they're planning to come, or if they already had plans set for the fall of this year, I would keep those in place and just keep watching. If I were planning a trip right now with a large group, I wouldn't plan for the fall. Because I think there'd be a lot of risks there. But if you're coming with just your family or a small group, even an organized group, but maybe less than 100 people, then yeah, I think you could plan for this fall as long as you had the deal with your travel agent and the hotel that you could bail without any penalty. And I think we need it. I think Israel is going to be safe and healthy by this fall. That's the hope and prayer so far.
Well, and again, since we're coming to a break, maybe we'll pick up some of that about the election after the break, because if I've counted right, and of course you're right there, this looks like the 4th election in 2 years. Is that at least accurate before we take a break?
That is accurate. And look, we say that we're the only real democracy in the Middle East. And we're not kidding, Kurt. We love elections, and we just apparently love to have them and have them. I can happily explain why when we get back.
Yeah, we will do that. Let me just also mention as well that the new book is out, The Beirut Protocol, and this is Marcus Riker, like you've never seen him before. I used to say when sometimes I would watch the TV show 21 and my wife would come in and say, what's going on? I said, well, Jack Bauer's having a really bad day. Well, Marcus Riker is having a really bad day, and we'll talk about that, where he finds himself face-to-face with Hezbollah firefight. He's taken captive along with a number of other individuals. This is while there's an attempt to try to have a peace conference and a variety of other things. So we will certainly get into the book, and I think you will certainly appreciate that. And of course, I've mentioned some of the others, the Jerusalem Assassin and the Persian Gamble and the Kremlin Conspiracy, and the list goes on and on, of so many of these books by Joel Rosenberg. 16 different novels so far, and of course the 5 nonfiction books, which we also recommend as well, because of the fact that you want to know what's going on from a prophetic point of view, certainly what is happening in terms of the epicenter. But when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about this election, what is happening with Benjamin Netanyahu. I know that Joel Rosenberg is going to have some comments about the difference in this current administration, President Biden, compared to the previous one with President Trump. So we'll get into those topics as well. But most importantly, do want to give you a chance to join the conversation today. That number is 1-800-351-1212. If you wanted to ask a question of Joel Rosenberg, make some comments, we certainly do welcome your phone calls. But we need to take a break, and when we come back, we will spend some more time talking with Joel Rosenberg, and then we'll get into the Beirut Protocol, another Marcus Riker novel. Talk about that. All of that coming up right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Do we have a crisis at the border? Earlier this month, the Biden administration acknowledged that it was a challenge, but downplayed that it was a crisis. The statement shows how politicians change the rules and criteria in order to fit their narrative. Alejandro Mayorkas serves as the Secretary of Homeland Security in the Biden administration. She rejected reporter questions about the crisis on the border by merely saying it was a challenge. But it was the same woman who a few years ago, as Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, who along with Vice President Joe Biden referred to the border crisis when there were 1,000 attempted crossings a day. The Border Patrol reported that on one day recently there were 6,000 border crossings in one day. When the Obama administration was in office 7 years ago, 1,000 border crossings in a day was a crisis. Today, in the Biden administration, 6,000 border crossings in a day isn't a crisis. Someone who believes it is a crisis is Democratic member of Congress Henry Cuellar. He finally decided to send pictures of a border facility crowded with men, women, and children to the Houston Chronicle. As a Democrat, he says he supports the Biden administration, but felt he needed to do more and encouraged the administration to listen to people at the border. He is frustrated that the administration is listening to the immigration activists and advocates and needs to listen to the border communities. If we're to address the festering problem of immigration and border security, we must start by telling the truth. Denying a crisis when one exists is not a good first step. I applaud Representative Cuellar for calling attention to an issue ignored by this administration and often ignored by the media. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have with us today, of course, New York Times bestselling author Joel Rosenberg, his new book, The Beirut Protocol, which we'll get to in just a minute. But, Joel, let's see if we can talk about this. 4 elections in 2 years. Part of it is trying to pull together a coalition, and certainly some of the things that Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to deal with. So maybe you could kind of give us a Knesset 101 and explain kind of what's happening right now.
Absolutely, Kerby. And this is one of the most fascinating things that we are covering at this new website, All Israel News, because Prime Minister Netanyahu has been the Prime Minister of Israel longer than any Prime Minister in the history of Israel. Okay, he served 3 years back in the 1990s, from 96 to 99, and then he was reelected in 2009, and he's been the Prime Minister ever since. We don't have term limits here. Okay, so an entire generation has grown up, and they think Netanyahu, that's the guy. He's the prime minister. But Netanyahu is facing his most serious political threat of losing since he lost in '99. Okay, and the reason is because while the vaccinations have gone well, the overall series of decisions that Netanyahu has made with regards to handling the COVID crisis has not gone well. Okay, so if you look at just over the past year, Netanyahu, you would think, okay, we have peace in Israel. We don't have a war. We have 4 Arab-Israeli peace deals that President Trump beautifully brokered. Right, we have peace deals, the Abraham Accords with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Sudan, with Morocco. We have other deals with Muslim countries like Kosovo. So some extraordinary things are happening. We had an excellent relationship with Trump, and Netanyahu persuaded Trump to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, et cetera, et cetera. That would seem like Netanyahu would be in for a landslide, right? However, the economy is shot here in Israel because the government has reopened then shut down, reopened then shut down, Netanyahu and his team have not passed a budget in an entire year. There's been squabbling that you cannot believe. Well, you could believe. You live in, you're covering Washington and everything else.
Yes.
But I mean, it's been bad here. And then, of course, the tourism industry is non-existent now. And 1 in 4 Israelis are either unemployed or just barely hanging on with maybe a minimum wage job or something that's well below their skills because of how bad the economy's been. So all of that has created an enormous amount of anger. You add to it one more factor, and look, let me be clear. Netanyahu is a shrewd political cat. I would not count this man out. He always seems to find a way to remain prime minister. However, in addition to the economic troubles, he's also under indictment in 3 different corruption cases.
Yes.
So fine. So you say, okay, well, he's innocent until proven guilty. True, but there's a growing percentage of the population that's like, enough. And then the last piece I would just say is it used to be the center and the left wing of Israel was against Netanyahu no matter what. And that remains the same. But a growing number of political leaders, heads of smaller parties on the center right, are now angry with Netanyahu for a range of reasons we could get into if you want. It might be too inside baseball. But the point is there's a growing number of political party leaders in Israel who say they will never form a government with Netanyahu. They'll never sit in a government with Netanyahu. This is narrowing steadily his pathway because there's only so many parties. There's only so many seats. And this is why Netanyahu and his Likud party will very likely come out as the largest party in the next election next week, maybe 30, 32 seats. But they might not be able to put together a coalition of 61 seats because of how Netanyahu has handled himself over the years. So that's what we're all watching to see. Are we heading into a post-Netanyahu era, or will the political cat find another political life?
And again, like you said, you have to form those coalitions, and that is key. You've mentioned it more than once. We have a link, of course, to joerosenberg.com, but we also encourage people to go to allisrael.com, which again is the All Israel news site, and that's where you cover a lot of that. And there's another part of that because there are certain individuals who might end up being prime minister who might say, we want to make sure that only people that are vaccinated come to Israel, and that could affect tourism, or that we will just keep it locked down for a longer period of time. We've seen this in this country, Joel, with sometimes the blue state governors oftentimes keeping things locked down more than the red state governors. So this election, in some respects, not only affects you in Israel, but it also affects the interaction that will take place with the Biden administration, may even affect tourism, won't it?
Well, that's right. And I think the tourism industry is certainly a big question here. And when can Christians and Jews and Muslims and others who consider this the Holy Land, when can they come back? This is the big question. But I think the point you just raised is very important, Kerby, about the relationship between the Israeli government and the new Biden administration. Netanyahu was perfectly cast and for a relationship with Donald Trump. They'd known each other for years, and Netanyahu's policies and the Trump policies were almost perfectly aligned. But there's a long history of tension between Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yes.
And this goes back many years. Now, the chemistry between them personally is much better, I will note, out of fairness, than Netanyahu's relationship with Barack Obama. That was cold. That was testy. There was anger, real anger between those two on many issues. Joe Biden is the type of person, he's just a warmer, friendlier person. And even though he disagrees with Netanyahu on many issues, He once actually Biden once signed a photograph of Netanyahu, and Biden signed it to Netanyahu and said, "Bibi, I don't agree with one bleeping thing that you stand for, but I always will love you. You're my brother," or something close to that. So it's a much warmer chemistry, but chemistry isn't enough, right? And what Netanyahu and all Israelis are worried about right now is that the question of whether Biden has learned from the disastrous Iran nuclear deal that he and Barack Obama did with Iran, 6-7 years ago, and is going to course correct, or is Biden sliding right back into the same sort of appeasement mode of Iran that characterized the Obama administration? And that's the current evidence suggests appeasement, not a tough line. So this is raising concerns among all Israelis. And I'll just add this last thing. So you could say that a new Israeli prime minister, whoever they were, might be able to have a better relationship with Biden. I think Israelis believe that, and they're weighing that. But on the other side, they're thinking, well, if we're going to go to a war with Iran, God forbid, if Biden can't handle this, if we get ourselves into a war that we can't help, maybe we want Netanyahu, in the cockpit as we go down that road. So there's a lot of calculations going on right now, and I cannot predict this one. I wouldn't even try.
I wouldn't either. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Joe Rosenberg, and we'll get into the Beirut Protocol, which is the latest Marcus Riker novel. That will get us into, of course, we'll obviously be talking about the border between Israel and Lebanon. We'll be talking about Hezbollah. We'll be talking about, of course, Iran, and a lot of that connects up with some of the conversation we've already had. Let me also encourage you to go to a couple of websites during the break. One is, of course, joelrosenberg.com. And that gives you an opportunity to see or even order any or all of his books, and I would encourage you to do so. There also is information about media, his podcast, and the rest that is available, some of the videos. He posts all sorts of news items, and of course, I do want you to also check out All Israel News, which is allisrael.com. You can find it there. And just before we finish off today, I always like to ask Joel a little bit about the Joshua Fund, because if you think about some of those individuals that were quarantined and some of those individuals that are working right now in very low-paying jobs or don't have a job at all, this has certainly been a ministry that he has had for years, and perhaps more necessary than ever before, because for us, the lockdown sometimes was inconvenient. For some, it could be absolutely devastating if you're a day laborer and you are dependent upon being able to work in order to buy food, and when you can't work, you can't buy food. So we'll talk about all of that with him, but we'll start off by focusing some time and attention on his latest novel, which is called The Beirut Protocol. You can find it in your local bookstore. Of course, you can find information about it on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Joe Rosenberg. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. The Beirut Protocol, and it is a Marcus Riker novel. Last time we were with you, of course, we were talking about Jerusalem Assassin, in which Marcus Riker found out that there was an assassination attempt being planned against the president during a peace conference. This time, though, here, Marcus Riker finds himself, of course, at the border between Israel and Lebanon, gets involved in a firefight. All of a sudden, he's staring into the face of angry Hezbollah, drops his M4 and realizes this is not going to go well, because now they are taken captive, tortured, brutalized, I guess is probably a better word, and that is, in a sense, how this particular novel unfolds. Tell us more, if you might.
Happy to, Kerby. The context remains the same of the last year's novel, The Jerusalem Assassin, in which the United States is trying to broker what I would call the mother of all Arab-Israeli peace deals, a peace deal between the State of Israel and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That is fiction at the moment. Nobody thinks that is likely to happen soon, although I think that it's actually more likely than most people believe. But in the novel, the U.S. and the Saudis and the Israelis have been having these peace talks and believe that a deal might be close at hand. But the closer they get to a peace deal, something that would be similar to the Abraham Accords, the Americans are worried that there will be forces that come out of the woodwork to try to blow up such a peace deal, a peace process even. And that would be from Iran and from Iran's terrorist proxy forces. Iran, funds, supplies, arms, trains, encourages a wide range of terrorist organizations. One of them is Hamas, which is the terror force in Gaza. One of them is Hezbollah, the terrorist force in Lebanon. And, of course, there's also the Houthis in Yemen, and there are others. But Hezbollah is the largest terror force in the world. It has killed more Americans than any terrorist organization in the world except Al-Qaeda. It is fund, fueled, trained, armed, encouraged. It was founded by Iran back in the early 1980s. And so in the Beirut Protocol, the U.S. Secretary of State is coming to Israel to try to finalize this peace deal. But because the U.S. is worried that Iran and Hezbollah might try to blow up the deal, the Secretary of State wants to take a tour of the Israeli-Lebanon border and kind of get an assessment of how dangerous are things with Hezbollah. Right now, in real life, Hezbollah has 150,000 Iranian missiles in southern Lebanon pointed at Israel. Okay, so in real life, southern Lebanon has become the forward operating base for the Iranian regime, and that's why I've turned into this novel, The Beirut Protocol, because as this terror attack happens, Marcus and his team are captured. They're pulled deep underground, deep behind enemy lines, and while they're underground being tortured, above ground, a missile war is erupting, and the whole chance for peace might be going up in flames with it. And that was supposed to be fiction. But I got to tell you, in recent weeks, there's a war of words going on here in the region between Hezbollah and Israeli leaders. And many people are starting to think that the exact scenario in my novel is actually the most likely scenario, God forbid, of a new war in 2021.
And almost every time, Joel, that you write a book, going all the way back to The Last Jihad and some of that, what you write is fiction, then sort of plays out in real life. And it isn't necessarily that you claim to be an Old Testament prophet or a son of a prophet, but you can look at some of these trends. You can look at some of these danger points and flashpoints. And so often your fictional novels end up almost being prophetic in terms of what is unfolding right there in the Middle East.
Well, it has certainly felt that way, and I have always disabused that notion that I'm trying to predict the future. That U.S. News report famously called me, or infamously called me, a modern day Nostradamus. I'm not a prophet. I'm not a psychic. I'm not a clairvoyant. I am writing about worst case scenarios that could happen if American or Israeli or other allied leaders don't take the threat seriously. And what's interesting about this one, you and I, Kerby, have talked about these albums, and you've made the same point, and then I say, "Oh no, I'm not. I'm not really predicting." And then you're like, "Yeah, but the book seems so like ripped from tomorrow's headlines." Listen, in this one, I started doing the research and writing of the Beirut Protocol back in 2019. Okay, and I wrote the novel. I finished it, let's say, by summer of 2020. Okay, so 7, 8, 9 months ago. So nobody was talking about Lebanon. I mean, Hezbollah, Lebanon. If you live in this region where I'm talking to you from Jerusalem, then yeah, it's a big topic. In America, in the midst of COVID and everything else, no, it just hasn't been a topic for years, actually. But in recent weeks, the head of Hezbollah, a guy named Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, has been making very, very dangerous threats. And Israeli leaders are making very public comments warning Hezbollah, don't go there. Don't think that you can start a war with us. Israel just 2 weeks ago ran an exercise in which they practiced doing everything but the actual bombing.
Wow.
With targeting 3,000 Hezbollah sites that they would hit in 24 hours. The preparations for war here are growing. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm praying it doesn't happen. But what I've written about in the Beirut Protocol is suddenly actually becoming a news story here that we may be heading towards a war with Lebanon. And I will just say this, that in 2006, we had our last war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. It was called the Second Lebanon War. Mm-hmm. The previous one was in the 1980s. In that 34-day war in 2006, Hezbollah fired 4,000 missiles at Israel.
Wow.
Okay? It drove 1 million Israelis underground and into bomb shelters, terrified of these missiles coming in. That was 15 years ago. Today, senior Israeli advisors and military officials tell me it could be 4,000 missiles a day.
Yes.
Raining down on Israel when the third Lebanon war breaks out. So we don't want this to happen. But the Beirut Protocol takes you into a world in which it does happen, and I show you why it happens and how we might get out of it. But I put my main character right smack dab in the middle of the horrific action.
And by being captured, he is kind of in the middle, so it helps you understand that. And again, for those that have traveled over to Israel, sometimes you'd pay attention to what was coming from Hamas out of Gaza, but most people aren't usually paying attention to Hezbollah in Lebanon. But this book will help you understand the dynamics there, and also their desire, I don't want to give away too much of the plot, of taking Marcus Riker and the others all the way to Israel, to Iran, with the idea that they could be executed because they would be kind of show prisoners as well. So there's just all sorts of elements into that tie into Iran. But let's take a break. And if you've been listening, because we are talking with Joel over there in Israel, occasionally we don't get the perfect reception, but it's working pretty well. And when we come back, do want to talk a little bit more about what we can do to support him, the Joshua Fund, the other books, and as well maybe just a little bit more of whether the opportunity for you to learn some more could be going to All Israel News, which is allisrael.com. And I guess given the fact we had a little bit of the transmission, maybe we're going to Well, we'll blame Hezbollah for that, I guess. That's what we'll do. We'll blame that. But we'll come back and spend some time talking with Joel Rosenberg. If you have any quick questions, 1-800-351-1212. If you want to ask your questions later, there will be an opportunity to do so. But we come back. I just wanted to give you another few minutes to hear some of the things that he has to share with us today while he is in Israel. We're all certainly wanting to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We certainly want to encourage those who are voting to vote wisely, and we certainly wonder what the future of Israel might be now with this fourth election in 2 years. And of course, we also need to be praying for our own president, President Biden, and his administration, and how they're going to interact with Israel as well. So there's just a lot to cover. We'll do our best in the next couple of minutes to continue our conversation with Joel Rosenberg. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like a little bit more information, we have a link to joelrosenberg.com. You'll also find one to allisrael.com. And those are some resources that I hope you'll take advantage of. But let's take a break. We have some news, information, and some comments. And when we come back, we'll continue our conversation right after these messages with Joel Rosenberg.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we are privileged to have with us for just a little bit longer Joel Rosenberg. Again, the new book of the Beirut Protocol. But Joel, I wanted to talk about some of the other ways people can connect up with you. Get a copy of the book, of course. They can go to joelrosenberg.com. They can go and also to All Israel News and go to allisrael.com and find some material there. But we also spend some time usually talking to you about the Joshua Fund. I know you have a Rapid Response Fund and just the whole issue of the epicenter. There are some great resources that are available to our listeners, but also there's very significant needs that you've had there in the Middle East because of the pandemic and the lockdowns. Can you give us some more information about that?
I'd be happy to. Kerby, thank you for asking about the Joshua Fund. I wouldn't say that there's been a year anything like this one in terms of the needs here in Israel and in the Arab world that we work for the church to have the resources to continue to pay its employees, to be able to provide humanitarian relief to widows, to orphans, Holocaust survivors, people who are suffering because of the economy, because of COVID. It's been a very hard year for ministries in Israel and in the 5 Arab nations that we work, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt, and of course, the Palestinian Authority. And so the Joshua Fund work has been more important than ever because what we are is like a mutual fund, right? And we are investing in these ministries to strengthen the church, help them teach the scriptures, share the gospel, train up the future pastors, care for the poor and the needy the way Jesus describes in Matthew 25 and other passages, and continue to do the work of showing the love of Jesus as well as sharing it. And in such an economic and health-related challenge, Joshua Fund has been pushed to its limits of trying to assist in every way we can. So, we would love to get more people involved, certainly in prayer. We got, as you've been saying, we need to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And the conversation we just had a moment ago explained why. But also we need to be praying for the health of Jerusalem and for the neighbors. We need to show compassion, to love our neighbors, to even love our enemies. And that's what the Joshua Fund is about. And people can learn more at joshuafund.com. And again, when I say mutual fund, it's like, so we hire and train and deploy pastors and staff to go get to know these ministries and to really understand who they are. Are they legitimate? Are they heretics, or are they real, Orthodox believers? Are they using the money the way they say they're going to use the money, and so forth? And so we want to be a trusted resource for Christians who say, yeah, I want to be a blessing to Israel and her neighbors. I know the biblical mandate to do it, but I wouldn't know the first place. I wouldn't know how to vet these ministries or these organizations. How would I know who is trustworthy? And I hope that the Joshua Fund can be that trusted resource for people. Make a donation of $25 or $50, $100 or whatever, and know that this is what we do. We've been doing it for 15 years almost, and it's so exciting. Kerby, I've said this to you. I think I would quit writing novels today, if I could just do the Joshua Fund. But God's message to me continues to be: look, train, recruit, assist, raise money for the Joshua Fund, but keep doing the other work of writing and speaking, because that's my role. And everybody has a role in the kingdom, and my role is not the day-to-day management of the Joshua Fund. But I'm the chairman, and my wife is on the board, and we love this team, and we are so proud of the work they're doing in literally the hardest year since we started.
And again, you can find that at joelrosenberg.com. One other thing I want to point you to real quickly is his blog. I noticed they did an interview about your book with the Jerusalem Post. Middle East expert fears train wreck in region if Iran is emboldened. Of course, you have the launch of the Beirut Protocol. So if people want to kind of follow you on a regular basis, they can sign up and get your blog too, can't they?
They can, and you can find that through joelrosenberg.com. Though I will tell you that most of the articles that I'm posting now are not at the blog. They are at All Israel News
Yes.
and All Arab News. And I'm finding, we saw over 1 million views of our material just last month. We're really gaining traction. We're getting to interview some of the top newsmakers in Israel, in the United States, in the Arab world, with exclusive interviews and analysis. People find it very hard. This is why you have me on, because it's very hard to know who to trust in the Middle East, and where you can find good reporting, solid analysis from a fair, but as well as a biblical worldview. That's your whole point. And that's what we decided. I finally decided, you know what? A blog is one thing, and it's good, but it's not enough. I need to build a team of young reporters and webmasters and editors and photographers. Let's build a team, and let's provide and create the greatest, the most effective coverage of Israel and the Arab and Middle East world, and of course Iran, of any site in the world. We link to good reports that others are doing. But, Kerby, you might even consider letting us be your news service and just linking to stories that you find interesting. That's what we're trying to be. Again, just as the Joshua Fund is a trusted resource for people who want to give and invest in ministries here, we want All Israel News to be the trusted resource for people who said, I want to know what's happening on a day-to-day basis. I wouldn't trust CNN for the life of me. So where do I go to get this information?
And again, All Israel News, tracking news and events impacting Israel and the Middle East for the world's 600 million evangelicals. And of course, we have that information there as well. And of course, you can click on, of course, to joelrosenberg.com and allisrael.com. A lot of great resources there. Joel Rosenberg, another great novel and a great interview. And so thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, I'm so glad to be with you, Kerby. My only regret is not being able to be in Dallas, sitting face-to-face with you or doing an event with you. I always love that. But Lord willing, in the future.
Well, Nels, I'm going to try to make it to Israel here sooner or later, as soon as you open up enough so that we can go
Even
do
better.
that. And we'll bring some
right,
point of view
sounds
listeners
good.
with us. Well, that's all we have for this hour. But again, Joel Rosenberg's been with us. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like some more information, well, it's at our website, pointofview.net. He was talking about being a trusted source of news and information. Well, my whole point of view is as well. And the banner that you see there that we have up right now is the very important issue of the fact that we're facing a crisis in truth. And so that's why we certainly, without apology, ask you to support this ministry so that you can hear these kind of interviews that we're doing today with Joel Rosenberg. At the top of the hour, we'll have Greg Koukl with us. He's written a very good piece, When Spiritual Heroes Fail. Sad commentary, but of course we've had some failures, and of course this was in some respects occasion because of what has happened to the Ravi Zacharias ministry. So we're going to talk about that, but the broader issue, of course, is one that we address as well. And these are topics, let's face it, you're never going to hear in the secular news media. Sometimes not even in Christian talk, you don't even hear that, but we cover those issues here on Point of View. We recognize, of course, there is a crisis in truth. Not only do we have individuals that are not getting the full story when they're simply tuning into the mainstream media, but oftentimes we're not even getting the whole story unless you are listening to programs like Point of View. So we're going to be covering in the next hour not only this issue when spiritual heroes fail, but we'll get into a variety of other topics in the news and try to give a Christian perspective to those. And so if you value that kind of news, information, and commentary, I hope that you will click on that banner, because there's a place for you to support this ministry as we try as hard as we can to be your trusted source of news, information, and commentary, to speak truth in a culture that seems to be post-truth. And so I hope you'll visit the website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us this hour. We're going to spend some time dealing with a difficult topic, but those are the kinds of things we like to address here on Point of View. And I think it's pretty common knowledge for all of us about what has happened with Ravi Zacharias' ministry. Matter of fact, I've got this article here, real questions about whether or not the organization not only would change its structure and function, which seems to be taking place right now, but even whether or not donors could hold RZIM and its board financially liable. There are all sorts of questions that surround that. But I think there is a broader question than just Ravi Zacharias. It is the question of what do we do and how do we react when a spiritual hero of yours fails? We've had many of those over the years, and it may be personal because it's been your pastor or youth pastor or your worship leader. Could be somebody in your community, somebody who led you to Christ, or it could be somebody who is known internationally. And so when I came across this very good piece by our friend Greg Koukl, who, by the way, has done such an outstanding job with Stand to Reason these years, helping you understand how to be an adequate and even efficient and excellent ambassador for Christ. They even have their STRU online training and the rest. I thought it would be good to bring Greg Koukl on to talk about his piece, and we have posted it on the website, and of course have a link to str.org where you can find all sorts of great information. Greg Koukl, of course, has been a talk show host for 25 years. He's an individual with a master's degree in philosophy of religion from Talbot with a master's in Christian apologetics. Matter of fact, an adjunct professor of Christian apologetics at Biola University all these years, and he is the individual that founded Stand to Reason and joins us now by phone. So, Greg, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, Kerby, it's always really great to talk to you. I really wish you were under different circumstances dealing with a different issue this time, but I'm really glad you're focusing on the broader questions that I address here and not drilling deep in the organizational stuff, which some people have to do, obviously. But anyway, thank you for giving me a chance to talk about this piece.
And again, even though we're talking about something that's a little difficult, I do highly recommend that you consider going to SDR and taking all the time you can to get some of their great information. You can click on the store there and find out about all the great material on apologetics and so many great ways in which you can be supported. And I was also struck by the fact that not only do you have your books there, but some books that we've been recommending, like Live Not by Lies by Rod Dreher and a number of others there. So this is a great one-stop shopping for students, for parents, for group study, for conferences and the rest. But okay, let's get into it. And again, if people would like to know more, we have that link on our website. But you, like everybody else, said, we owe a debt of gratitude to Ravi Zacharias and all the other individuals with that organization. I've interviewed on that. But at the same time, there's a real fundamental question about how does one respond when you have somebody that you've looked up to for so many years, literally for so many decades for some of us, that when you find out of a failing, how to respond. So help us kind of think through that.
Well, in this case, to call it a failing, and I know you're being charitable, is kind of an understatement because what Ravi was guilty of, and I'm just going to say this up front in general so that people don't get the feeling I'm trying to sidestep the big issue here. What Ravi did was manipulative and vile. It was predatory sexual immorality. It was spiritual deceit. It was professional duplicity. It was disgusting and evil, and he did not repent of it. So when we see the full picture of what this man represented, especially at the end of his life, he is not a man to be held up as an honorable individual. Now, having said that and gotten that behind me, part of my struggle, Kerby, was trying to figure out helping those people who are shocked and dazed and stunned and shaken, understandably, who don't know how to process this kind of news, and they don't even know where to start. And so what I've offered were 5 different keys, I guess, or thoughts, things that I draw on for myself, Kerby, when I face this kind of circumstance with other people, including with Ravi. And I didn't know Ravi real well. We weren't friends. I never had a meal with him. We were colleagues. We did events together. Our paths crossed, et cetera, here and there. But I don't have a horse in this race for him personally, but what I'm trying to do is see what can we rescue from the fire here for people that are struggling. And these were the 5 things. There were 5 things that I came up with that I think will help people in thinking about this, not just with Ravi, but with anybody else they're facing in a similar kind of situation.
Well, let's go through those, and people can number 1 to 5, but of course they can print this out. First is guard your own soul, and that is something I've said to individuals whenever it has been a situation with their pastor, youth leader, Ravi Zacharias in this case, televangelist, whatever. Greater men and women than you and I have failed and have fallen into sin. So first of all, look internally even before you go any further. That's a very good point.
Yeah, you're combining 2 points there, actually. I'll get to the second in a moment. But when I say guard your own soul, I'm thinking about the tendency people have to slow down when there's a wreck and look at the gore, on the freeway. And this is not a good thing. I don't care about the freeway thing. But when we're talking about the moral behavior of somebody's life, there are all kinds of warnings in Proverbs not to go there. This is why we're not supposed to gossip. The words of a whisperer go deep down inside of our heart, Proverbs says. And there's a sense in which, Kerby, when we hear something really gross and bad about somebody, even if it's true, that never goes out of our soul. It sticks there, and it soils us. And there are people that need to know the details, the principles involved, people who are involved with the victims and caring for the victims in the way they ought to be cared for thoroughly, But there's a whole bunch of us, and you and I have a little bit of an in-between role because of our voice that we have, but there's a whole bunch of us that are just kind of bystanders, and we know about this, we anguish about it, and then we move on. And I encourage, in fact, this is the only interview I'm giving, Kerby, regarding what I wrote, because I want people to move on and focus differently, because I think that we need to guard, as I point out here, our own souls when it comes to the darkness and the details of these kinds of sins, and not just from Christian leaders, but other sins as well. Paul says that the dark deeds of sin must be exposed, but it's also shameful to even speak of these things in public, he says in Ephesians chapter 5. So I think this is one way we guard our souls. We learn, we're anguished, but for me, when I hear about things like this, for the most part, I've moved on. I got the facts, the basic. Now I'm moving on, and I'm not focusing in. I'm not going to participate because it's not good for my soul. I'm going to guard my soul by not getting any more information than is necessary, and for most people, that's very little.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get the other 4, and they go through pretty quickly. But again, we wanted you to understand why we thought this was important. And again, just great praise to Greg Koukl for writing this, and also for his willingness to consent to doing this one interview. And if you find yourself saying, I know individuals that are maybe wondering about this, or maybe you are, we have made it very easy for you by going to our website, pointofview.net, to click on the picture of Greg Koukl, and you'll find that particular piece, When Spiritual Heroes Fail. Or, of course, you can also go to STR, again, it stands for Stand to Reason, str.org, for Clear Thinking Christianity. So we'll continue our conversation as we talk about what to do when spiritual heroes fail. We'll talk about that right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Do Do we have a crisis at the border? Earlier this month, the Biden administration acknowledged that it was a challenge, but downplayed that it was a crisis. The statement shows how politicians change the rules and criteria in order to fit their narrative. Alejandro Mayorkas serves as the Secretary of Homeland Security in the Biden administration. She rejected reporter questions about the crisis on the border by merely saying it was a challenge. But it was the same woman who a few years ago, as Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, who along with Vice President Joe Biden referred to the border crisis when there were 1,000 attempted crossings a day. The Border Patrol reported that on one day recently there were 6,000 border crossings in one day. When the Obama administration was in office 7 years ago, 1,000 border crossings in a day was a crisis. Today, in the Biden administration, 6,000 border crossings in a day isn't a crisis. Someone who believes it is a crisis is Democratic member of Congress Henry Cuellar. He finally decided to send pictures of a border facility crowded with men, women, and children to the Houston Chronicle. As a Democrat, he says he supports the Biden administration, but felt he needed to do more and encouraged the administration to listen to people at the border. He is frustrated that the administration is listening to the immigration activists and advocates and needs to listen to the border communities. If we're to address the festering problem of immigration and border security, we must start by telling the truth. Denying a crisis when one exists is not a good first step. I applaud Representative Cuellar for calling attention to an issue ignored by this administration and often ignored by the media. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Please stay with us for a few more minutes, Greg Koukl, as we talk about his article, which we have posted, When Spiritual Heroes Fail, and it is very well done. And the first point, guard your own soul. Very wise. Don't get into all the details. Don't worry about those kinds of things. But then there are four other points, Greg, that you use, and I sort of combine the two because the second one is do not be surprised when sinners sin. Yeah. And that should not surprise a Christian, but it is amazing how many times it does. Tell us more.
Well, in some sense, it is shocking when a spiritual leader that you look up to and you have every reason to think otherwise, it turns out to have been guilty of very evil behavior. And so that's shocking. But I have a very healthy biblical anthropology. I understand what the Bible says. And even Jesus, early on in the book of John, when many were believing in him, he said, the text says he didn't entrust himself to them because he knew what was in man. And this is an opportunity for us to take a closer look at what the Bible teaches about human beings, that each is guilty or capable of very significant sin and many times guilty of it. I mean, look at Peter denied Christ, for goodness sake, with an oath, and how terrible can you get? And so this is an opportunity for us to see the world the way it really is, the way the Bible describes it, and, as you pointed out, look to ourselves. Because sin crouches at our door, even the so-called greatest among us, and we have a responsibility to work closely with the body of Christ, friends, accountability, to make sure that we don't falter badly like that too.
So again, those are two very key points. Let's take a couple more. Number 3, remember truth is still true. And boy, Greg, if there's one thing that I know that you've focused lots of your time and attention on all these many years, it is the fact that we are in this post-truth culture. And if nothing else, sometimes we're even in a post-truth church culture that we need to fight against. And so that's another key point, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Ironically, this kind of works against that trend that you just identified, because what will happen is people are going to take advantage, and they already have, of a failing like with the Ravi Zacharias, and then somehow think that it discredits the objective truth claims of Christianity. See, Christianity is just a farce. Look at what this guy did. Well, of course, nothing that any individual Christian does can falsify the claims of Jesus of Nazareth. The truth of our view rests on the shoulders of only one man, and that's Jesus. And so these are external to any particular behaviors of someone else, whether God exists or Christianity is true or Jesus rose from the dead or any of the things that we claim are central to Christian doctrine do not rest on the shoulders of any human being that may sin and falter. So pointing out the person's sin, which may be accurate, is not in itself a discredit of the things that that person taught or believed to be so. Those have to be adjudicated on different grounds. And I'm just saying we have to keep these separate, because for Christians to find out what happened, then they go, oh my gosh, maybe my view is false, like other people are saying, taking advantage, the critics taking advantage of these circumstances, when in fact, human behavior has nothing to do with whether or not our views are false. It's a different category. We have to look at those things independently.
And again, you've seen this over the years, young people going off to college that gave up on their faith, and you interview them and you start talking about Christianity, and you find out, well, actually, they grew up in the church, and then their mother ran off with the worship leader or something like that, and they've run away from Christianity because somebody that they held maybe in too high of esteem faltered, and then that caused their whole truth claim and their whole foundation for their belief to crumble. So it's a good point.
That takes us back to number 2. Don't be surprised when sinners sin, right?
Well, let's get a couple more in there because I wanted to cover all of them.
Sure.
Of course, we talked about truth. What about this idea of do not become cynical? That's your 4th point.
Well, you know, I had a close friend after we learned of these events and everything was verified. My friend said, who am I going to trust now? Who can I trust? And my response was this: you trust everyone you have good reason to trust, or to put it conversely, you have no reason to mistrust, which is most of the people in our lives. And are we going to be mistaken sometimes? Sometimes, yes, but not very often. Because, you know, Kerby, you know enough people that they're serving the Lord, either in high positions or lower positions of visibility, and they are doing so with integrity and with charity and with grace. And I think this is true of the vast majority of Christian workers. So what I don't want Christians to start doing is looking over their shoulder, looking around themselves, imagining a pervert under every bush just because you have someone that has faltered badly.
And again, sometimes I'll hear people say, well, I'm not going to trust anyone. Did you get on an airplane? Well, you're trusting the pilot for sure.
That's right.
Did you call a Uber? You don't even know the person that's going to take you, and yet you trust them. And do you trust the doctor that you don't even know if that medical degree on the wall is actually valid? Of course you do. And, of course, this idea of cynicism runs through our culture, so that's the case. But I want to get to the 4th one, and this one gets us back to us again, and that is firmly resolved to finish well. You know, I can't be concerned always about what someone else does, but I certainly have a responsibility, and God holds me responsible for what I do.
That's right. You know, we serve before an audience of one, Kerby, and I know this is an important part of your own convictions in your life. Whether people agree or disagree or not, these are the shifting winds, right? But we're living our lives before God and seeking to live honorably before Him in everything we do. This is something we're capable of doing, even if other people are going awry. And my desire is that when I pass, when I shuffle off this mortal coil, that I hear the words, well done, good and faithful servant. And I hope that everyone else that is listening to us that is a Christian and committed to the Christianity and to Jesus and to honoring him will have the same desire, because those are the only final words that really matter. Well done, good and faithful servant. That's what I want to hear. My encouragement to everyone else is don't be like those who fell. Rather finish well. And it's a long road. It's not easy. We need each other's help. We need the Holy Spirit, but make it your goal to finish well.
Let me, if I can, just before I let you go, talk about the fact last time we had you on talking about the 10th anniversary edition of Tactics.
Yeah.
I cannot tell you the number of people over my lifetime, over these last 10 years, I guess I should say, that I've recommended that book Tactics to. And as you go to the website, str.org, you might go to the store if you don't have a copy of that book, but you also have just all sorts of other great resources that are available to individuals and online education. So just for a few minutes, talk about what's available at Stand to Reason.
Well, the Tactics book is, and I just happened to go on Amazon, not to wave my own flag, but since you brought it up, I have over 1,700 customer reviews, and the average is 4.9. So I'm not going to complain about that.
That is terrific.
But at STR, we have to get the book, the 10th anniversary edition of Tactics, and the Story of Reality, which we've talked about in the past, you and I. And we have a new thing that we're doing at Stand to Reason now, and it's called STRU.
Yes.
And so you can actually take short courses that have 4 or 5 or to 10-minute segments, and boom, 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 boom through these segments, so you get the full course. Very easy to do. We call it STRU, and there's a upper right-hand corner of the website. There's an icon you can click. We also have a brand new thing. If people go to YouTube and just type in Red Pen Logic.
I love
Red
him.
Pen Logic.
He does so good.
Oh,
Yeah.
Tim Barnett, you've seen it. So these are fabulous fun. They're only about 7 minutes long, and they are critiques of memes on the internet that people may have seen. So I just want to direct them there, and it speaks for itself. Just check that out. So,
and I love it because Tim does such a good job, because what he does, he gets his red pen out and points out all the errors and things of that nature, and he does it in such a humorous way that, first of all, there's just all sorts of great resources at STR, but that's been another one that I've talked to people about. And, of course, STRU, which is an online course. So there's just so much to find. So visit the website, pointofview.net, or go directly to str.org. Either way will get you there. And Greg Koukl, I wanted to end on a positive note. And, again, congratulations on Tactics, and congratulations on all you've done at STR.
Thank you, Kirby. You keep up the good work. You're at a tough spot. Hang in there.
We will take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some other issues. In the news, I've got one on the party of groupthink. We'll talk a little bit about what's going to be coming down from Congress. 8 worst parts of H.R. 1. Might get into that. Friday, you might have noticed we had this ongoing kind of conversation about how the military is coming down on Tucker Carlson about some of the things he said. And then the response is, well, the issue of inclusion and diversity is our strength in the military. Really? Are you kidding about that? And before we're done, I did post one about a boxing legend who's died after getting a vaccine. Well, we now know a little bit more about how many people after having the vaccine have died. Did they all die because of the vaccine? Well, we'll get into some of that as well. So we have a lot to cover. We'll try to do it in half an hour, but we'll get started right after these important messages.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees, and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, let me just mention as a program note that tomorrow we have Russ Vogt on talking about political hegemony, and we'll get into that and what that means tomorrow. And then in studio with us in the second hour, we'll be talking with our good friend Eric Metaxas. He has a new book out. It made sense that since he's done so many biographies, this one's sort of an autobiography. So we'll learn a little bit more about him in studio and get his thoughts about a number of different topics. We have posted quite a number of articles. I may not get through all of them in the next half hour, but we'll do our best. And if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. First article is one that came out of the Washington Examiner. It's a commentary called The Party of Groupthink. James Artle talks about this, and he's really helping us understand that in some respects, even though Joe Biden ran as an individual that could oftentimes put together bipartisan deals, it really hasn't happened. And we sort of knew that because the other part of his claim was that he would help fulfill Bernie Sanders' wish to be the most progressive president since FDR. And as this article points out, various left-wing Democrats who did not turn out for Hillary Clinton, partially because they were angry about the way Bernie Sanders was treated, did turn out for Joe Biden. And so as a result, now have, in some respects, really solidified almost an ideological purity, not necessarily saying that in a positive sense, but ideological purity in terms of the Democratic Party, especially in Congress. If you look at it, this most recent vote on the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, as it was called, did not have one Democrat vote against it, 50-49. In the House, only one didn't vote for it. And so that is remarkable. And this is something which Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee argued that 91% of the spending is money for the arts, humanities, transportation, abortion, loan forgiveness for students, loan forgiveness for socially disadvantaged farmers and those kinds of things, because her argument is only 9% of it went directly to COVID. Well, I think that 9% number is inaccurate, because if you look at other things that were affected by COVID, including people who didn't have jobs or lost businesses, you can make that number a lot higher than 9%. But you certainly can't get it very high. And even the most liberal think tank that I quoted from last week, which was using unbelievably generous assumptions, still only said about 85%. That was their high number, was actually related to COVID, and that was using some very questionable assumptions. But okay, even if you say 85%, that still means 15% had nothing to do with it, and that 15% equals, about $300 billion. But again, notice not one Democrat voted against it in the Senate, only one voted against it in the House. And now back to the article. They point out that Democrats are legislating right now with razor-thin majorities, but what's going to happen in the future? We have H.R. 1, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, the For the People Act, and we even have an action item on that, which would be devastating, I think, to our elections. You have the Equality Act, which is redefining the whole issue of what sex means under the federal civil rights law and could have such a devastating impact on religious liberty. You have an immigration plan that's comprehensive, and right now what you have is the possibility that all of those could be enacted. They've all been passed, or most of them that I've just mentioned have been passed through the House of Representatives. The only question is what happens in the Senate. And this particular article reminds us that not so long ago, you didn't have such a ideologically homogeneity in terms of the party. You had, for example, a few people they mentioned, for example, Representative Dan Lipinski in Illinois, who was probably one of the few pro-life Democrats in the Congress as a Democrat, but nevertheless fell to liberal primary challengers. And you have Representative Colin Peterson in Minnesota, which was unseated by the Republicans. And so as a result, you have almost a kind of an ideological purity. And then they contrast that, for my listeners in Georgia, going back to, remember when President Clinton oftentimes had to deal with Senator Sam Nunn, who was, of course, a Southern conservative Democrat, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, who really kind of balked at the idea of homosexuals in the military and those kinds of things. And so there were certain things that Bill Clinton could not do because he had Democrats in his own party that didn't want to go that far to the left. As he points out now, you have 2 Democratic senators from Georgia that are staunch liberals. Even when Barack Obama was president, President Obama had to shelve, for example, the public option in his health care plan because he had a number of moderate Democrats. And so as a result, you really have just a different kind of situation that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have now. So the only real question is, will the filibuster remain? If it does, then you need 60 votes to vote on those pieces of legislation that have already been passed out of the House or will in the future be passed out of the House. And those are, elections, there are gun control issues, of course, be immigration in the future, the Equality Act, on and on and on. There's just so many of those issues. But that is only going to happen if the filibuster remains. Now, you might just real quickly wonder, well, how did you pass the COVID relief bill, stimulus bill, with just 50 votes? And the reason for that is they use what's called budget reconciliation. But that is very limited, both in the terms of subject matter and absolute number of times this year that it could be used. But if that changes, we will see a remarkable change in the nation simply because of so many of those pieces of legislation that have passed through the House that in the past, when you had a Republican-controlled Senate, went to go and die there, but now could continue on. Let me just mention in passing, if nothing else, the whole issue of whether or not you might want to contact your 2 United States senators about this, what is called H.R. 1. It's called For the People Act, and the second article I've posted here, and I won't read all of the objections, but they come from Hans von Spakovsky. And, of course, one of the things that I think is most legitimate is the fact that he served as a commissioner on the Federal Elections Commission, former counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and, if nothing else, points out what he calls 8 of the worst parts of this particular piece of legislation. I won't read through all of those other than to simply mention that it is available in case you'd like to read a little bit more and learn more about some of the problems associated with it. Which brings me to my third article that I wanted to get into real quickly. And this is a piece that we've posted by Matt Walsh, in which he points out that there has been this incredible controversy over the last week or so, simply because one of the talk show hosts at Fox, Tucker Carlson, raised some questions about this speech given by President Biden, in which, speaking on International Women's Day, focused his time and attention on the fact that they were going to offer maternity flight suits and update the hairstyle requirements and those kinds of things to help women. And, of course, he raised the question as to whether or not that is the highest priority for the military. And so, interestingly enough, the reaction that came back from the military brass is that we value our promotion of diversity and inclusion. And if nothing else, he points out the fact that these are changes being proposed not on science, but on ideology. Maybe explains a little bit why there have been so many posted websites and posted tweets criticizing Tucker Carlson, one saying, well, the cable show host has no military experience, and that the decision to include more pregnant women in the armed forces was made by medical experts. And I love what Matt Walsh says. The problem with the first argument is besides the point. You can certainly criticize and raise common sense questions about the military, whether you've served in the military. And the fact that medical experts says it's okay to have pregnant women piloting aircraft does not mean that it's even better or even good to actually have that taking place. And then he gives us some points that, the Biden administration's not trying to include women in the military, that's been done for decades, but to try to take an active level to increase more and more, and points out that if you look at some of the surveys, and I love this one that he quotes from, which was reported by NPR, that even the military, and in particular the Marine Corps, found that the all-male units were faster and more lethal. And so he comes to the logical common sense conclusion that faster and more lethal, well, that's probably better. Rather than slower and less lethal, that's probably not as good. And if nothing else, it just illustrates again that you might not want to have picked a fight with the military, but you might want to say, if your best argument is inclusion, maybe you need to go back and ask yourself, what's the military for in the first place? We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that this piece by Matt Walsh, which we've posted, it's 5 pages, and I really do encourage you to read it because, as I said just as we were going to the break, I wouldn't pick a fight with the military. As a matter of fact, last time we talked about this on Friday, I said, look, we support those of you that have served in the military and certainly want to make the military the most effective it can possibly be because it is what keeps us safe. But I think many of you that have served in the military would be the first to admit that sometimes you've not always been well served by your leaders. And so you can't say anything about that, especially if you're still in the military, but we can. And more to the point, I wouldn't have picked a fight on this, but I'm not going to back away from it if for no other reason than this idea that inclusion is our strength. Seriously? I mean, that's a question I think is important. And you can see the headlines, Military Times, senior leaders dunk on Tucker Carlson's comments about maternity flight suits. NBC, Tucker Carlson slammed by military leaders for mocking pregnant service members. I don't think he did, but okay. Yahoo News, Pentagon takes unprecedented shot at Tucker Carlson for dissing military diversity. You know, I do know who the enemy is, and it's China. It's not Tucker Carlson. And this has led the senator from Texas, Republican, Ted Cruz, to actually now call for any kind of, maybe even an investigation or hearing or something. He said, look, under President Biden, he said, the military is launching political attacks to intimidate Tucker Carlson and other civilians who criticize their policy decisions. He sent a letter to the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. And he goes on to say, officials in uniform are being used for the campaign. I'm demanding a meeting with the commandant of the USMC to put a stop to it, in which he points out, of course, and you that have served in the military know this only so well, that the Department of Defense Directive 1344 notes that members of the U.S. military are not permitted to engage in partisan politics. And then, of course, you can see this long series of tweets, videos, and others that are all criticizing Tucker Carlson. And again, it's amazing to me. First of all, they might just say, well, these are not partisan. Well, maybe not. We're just defending the military. But in some respects, the point that Tucker Carlson was making would be one that I would think they'd say, okay, we recognize China as our enemy, but we also recognize we have a place for women in here, and that will make us more effective. Okay, I'll accept that. But when you start saying that inclusion and diversity are our strength, then why even have military academies? Why even have various standards? And I think you've got some big issues to address. But the last issue I want to address real quickly, and we may get to some of these phone calls tomorrow, is to actually take a news peg that I've been looking for to hang the bigger question of how many people have been dying after taking the vaccine. So the article that I've posted here is about the boxing legend, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, who died Saturday night. And he had taken the vaccine, and then you had various Twitter posts saying things like, great, Marvin Hagler dies after taking the vaccine. Please do your own research before making a decision on putting something in your body that has not been tested properly. We're being used as guinea pigs, get those kinds of things. And so this is one of the many anecdotal stories that are out there. Another one that's got quite a bit of press lately has been this 39-year-old woman in Utah who had no underlying health conditions, but nevertheless died 4 days after receiving her second dose of the Moderna vaccine. And so there have been various claims out there being made of, and the one that you see most often, that's the one I'm going to focus on right now, is that 966 people have died after being vaccinated. And so it fell upon Newsweek to actually do kind of a fact check. Now, first of all, where does that number 966 come from? First of all, that's 966 as of March 6th. We, of course, almost a week later from that, so more than a week later, I guess I should say some that. But that number comes from the CDC's, that would be the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. I have mentioned that, I think, once before on this program. And if you go to look at that date and you find that then what it is 472 people died after receiving the Moderna vaccine. 489 died after receiving the Pfizer vaccine. And then additionally, 5 people died from an unknown vaccine. They're not sure which one of those. And so here are the facts. Are there hundreds of people on this database that have died after getting the COVID vaccine? The answer is yes. Newsweek, though, calls it mostly true because it is true those people have died. but that does not necessarily mean the vaccine was the cause. And so they rate this particular claim as mostly true because, after all, you look at this, what's called the VERS system. That's the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. You can read it for yourself. And it's full of data. Then there's another one which is called the Wonder system. I won't even get into that since we're getting close on time, which give you slightly different numbers. But they rate the point that, yes, it is true those people have died, but it quite likely is that they had secondary effects. Now, I have been researching this for some time, and the first time the CDC posted that goes all the way back to January. So I've been kind of sitting on this for a while here. And the one going from those people who had been vaccinated from the middle of December to about the middle of January, just before Joe Biden became the president. Okay, so that would be under the Trump administration. They had 518 serious events, and they had 35 deaths. 16 from the Pfizer vaccine, 19 from the Moderna vaccine. And so they did a study because the CDC wanted to say, okay, can we link that to actually getting the vaccine? Their review concluded at that time, looking at that one which was vetted back in January, that a review found that maybe 16 of the 35 reported deaths had some kind of underlying issue: heart disease, cancer, stroke, probably pulmonary embolism, or some other frail health. And because some of those individuals were in nursing homes, I don't mean to sound cavalier or crass, but you might have expected some of that. So the point that people are making is that very few people are dying from this vaccine, because now we have, I don't know, even back then you had 65 million doses. Now we have hundreds. So, we're the numbers are climbing all the time. But I think that also brings us back to a key issue. If you go even out on the internet and type in how many people have died from the COVID vaccine, you won't find many hits, because there almost seems to be an attempt to say, we're not going to cover it. We are. And I recognize that there are all sorts of possibilities for people reacting to the vaccine, some of them which have very significant secondary effects, especially after the second dose. And as I've shared before, when I was growing up as a kid, one of my best friends went into the hospital. They gave him penicillin, and he died. I don't think he would have died today, because we would have been maybe anticipating a reaction to penicillin, but we recognize sometimes that takes place. But I did want to use that because you're probably going to see all sorts of Twitter posts now because of the death of Marvin Hagler, a boxing legend, because he's pretty well known, at least by people in the field of athletics. And so I thought we would cover it today here on Point of View. Tomorrow we'll spend some time talking with Russ Vogt. We'll talk with Eric Metaxas, and we hope to talk with you. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.